Good evening, everyone. We've got a lot of people filtering in tonight. We'll give them just a moment or so. Good evening, good evening. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We'll get started in a moment or so. If in the meantime, you'd like to share in the chat where you are joining us from, that's always fun to see. Good evening and welcome. We'll get started in just a moment. Nancy from Chelmsford, thanks for being here. It's always so nice to see so many familiar names, and now I've got faces for some of those names too. Tish, good to see your name too. So we have folks from Wilmington, Tewksbury, Milton, Mass, Groton, Mass, Ocean Pines, Maryland. Marcia, good to see you here tonight. Deborah from Amesbury, Jacksonville Beach, Florida. Thanks for joining us. Vineyard Haven, Massachusetts, Seattle. Dee, I know your name too. Judy Gross is here from Hollis. Thanks for joining us. Wow, I feel like I know all of you. Do I know everybody in tonight's Zoom? Oh, we've got people from Norwich, Vermont, Wilmington, Massachusetts, Hingham, Massachusetts, Boston. Oh, and people even know each other in this Zoom. This is great. Greenfield, Mass, Kennebunk, Maine, Clinton, Mass, the Berkshires. Very nice. Rono, Maine, Groveland, Amesbury, Vineyard Haven, Sarasota, Natick, Mass, Charleston, South Carolina. We've got great representation on the Eastern Seaboard tonight. Barbara and Bob from Amherst. Hi from Tewksbury. Met Museum in Manhattan. Fun. And Arlington Heights, Sharon, Mass, Haverhill, Amherst, New Hampshire, San Jose, California. Patty, thanks for joining us, spreading out our demographic a little bit. We are up to about 265 people so far. We'll get started momentarily. It's always so nice to see where everybody's joining us from, and I'm just delighted that you're here. We are in for such a treat tonight. Thinking about the work of Leonardo da Vinci. I will admit, Leonardo da Vinci has taken up so much room in my brain over the past month or so. I was actually giving a talk on fierce females earlier today, and during the Q&A, I just kept going back to Da Vinci, which is not on subject. So, okay, we've got quorum, I think. So welcome officially again. I'm delighted you're here. Thank you to our hosting libraries, including the Chelmsford Public Library. We're using their Zoom tonight. And my name is Jane Oneail. I am the founder of Culturally Curious. And with my company, I specialize in putting together art appreciation programs like this one. This is my first time presenting Leonardo da Vinci for the Chelmsford Public Library. And if you've never been to one of these programs before, it's basically like a street lecture. But if you have questions or comments along the way, please feel free to use the chat or the Q&A function, and then I'll circle back to everything at the end and do my best to try and answer your questions. So, Leonardo da Vinci. There's been so much that has been written and so much that has been produced in terms of documentaries. I'm going to try and break this down and make Leonardo da Vinci really easy to understand tonight. So let me give you a sense in terms of how we'll spend this hour together. It's a really simple program overview for tonight. We're going to get started with a very brief introduction to Leonardo. And then I broke this up into two main sections. Invention. We all know that Leonardo da Vinci was sort of our quintessential Renaissance man, a scientist, an engineer. And we're going to loosely group his drawings as evidence of that very inventive thinking. And then we consider creation, and that's where we'll be looking at some of his significant paintings. He did not produce many paintings in his lifetime, and we have very little time to go over the paintings that we can look at. So we're just looking at a small fragment, a small subset of his finished paintings. Now, for Leonardo da Vinci, there was no distinction between drawings and paintings. All of these things blended together, as we'll see tonight. So as we're thinking about Da Vinci, Keep in mind, he is the original Renaissance rock star. He was the master of art and science and everything in between. He was a figure who was so ahead of his time. Some of the inventions he was imagining, we'll see, didn't come into fruition until centuries later. So he was a visionary, and I think most scholars across all disciplines would agree he was this rare talent with an unparalleled capacity for creativity and invention. So that leads us right into tonight's program. So we're going to get started with a few touchstones when we think about Leonardo, the things that are most familiar to us, probably getting started with the Da Vinci Code. Of course, we all probably read it, whether or not we want to admit it. I'm actually rereading an adult adaptation of it with my 9-year-old son, and he is hooked. So the Da Vinci Code, of course, sold about 80 million copies. Back in 2003, it seemed like there was this unquenchable thirst for understanding these images that have been around for 500 years. They're simple, but they are iconic in so many ways. So we understand that there's this present day desire to understand and sort of consume Da Vinci's images. And that is especially true for the image that we have here on the right side of the screen. This is a painting that is purported to be by Leonardo or his students. Many hands have altered the image over time, apparently. It's called Salvator Mundi, or Savior of the World. You can see Jesus sort of with giving a benediction here, or a blessing, and he's holding this glass sphere in his hand as a representation of the world. Now, this is a particularly famous Da Vinci because it sold for $400 million at auction, blowing away all auction records ever. Plus, there was a $50 million commission fee. So when all was said and done, $450 million. And really, there probably won't be another chance to buy a Da Vinci like this anytime soon. So just to reinforce this notion of just how relevant Da Vinci is to our culture, have we already forgotten last month the big brouhaha over the Paris Olympics opening ceremony? People got upset, people got offended that it was too close to Da Vinci's rendition of the Last Supper. It's not even the Last Supper itself. It said it was too close to what now feels like a sacred image, right? So it's really interesting for me to think about how important Da Vinci was to that conversation that it felt like nobody was really mentioning. So let's get to know this man, shall we? All right, we've got our map of Italy here, and you can see the city of Florence, and about 17 miles away is the small town of Vinci. We're looking at an image of it over here on the right. So that's where he gets his name. Most people were not named after the places that they came from, but Leonardo da Vinci is kind of special because, well, he was illegitimate. So he couldn't inherit his father's name. His mother was a peasant woman. So he was just known as Leonardo of Vinci. And art historians are very quick to point out the fact that we should not call him Da Vinci, because that's like calling like Joan of Arc. It doesn't really mean anything. But I feel like my personal opinion is that ship has sailed ever since the Da Vinci Code. I think people are more familiar with the name Da Vinci than Leonardo. So I might go back and forth tonight. Don't come at me for it. So the last thing I wanted to mention with this slide is here's this young man. He doesn't have the status of somebody who was born into, a proper marriage. So the one way that really impacted Leonardo as a young boy, it meant that he couldn't receive a classical education. He did receive some informal schooling. There are stories out there that he surpassed his teachers at a very young age, but he did not learn Greek and Latin. He didn't learn the official, basically avenues of learning for that day. And that might have liberated him, as it all turns out. It might have allowed him to think freely and in new ways about everything because he wasn't learning the same way as everybody else. He was an autodidact, clearly. He taught himself so much, and he called himself a disciple of experience. So he was observing the world and learning so much from that. Now, when he was just a teenager and his family was at that point living in Florence, that is when he really got his first taste of fine art, because he became a studio boy in a very big, very busy workshop in Florence under the master Andrea del Verrocchio. And we can see him in a portrait over here. The image on the right is just to give us a sense of what a Renaissance workshop would have looked like. Really busy with all of these people working in a variety of media. They might be doing paintings, sculptures. Verrocchio's workshop was doing metal work and leather work and woodworking. So young Leonardo, when he first gets there, is probably just like sweeping the floors and like mixing pigments. But we know he gets noticed early on because it is said that young Leonardo might have actually posed for the sculpture that we see over here on the right. So this is Andrea del Verrocchio's sculpture of the biblical figure of David. He created this sculpture sort of in response to an earlier depiction of David by his own master, Donatello. Donatello's David was not very well received. It was a little too gender ambiguous. And so Verrocchio is going for, well, now not a nude figure, and one that maybe has more distinctive masculine features. And especially when we zoom in on that face, we can see that if this is young Leonardo, he was quite a handsome young boy. So that got him some attention. I should also mention that working in the studio, there was a generation of artists just slightly older than him. Artists like Botticelli and Perugino, some of the greatest artists of the early Italian Renaissance. They were all there. They're all sharing their experiences, their ideas. It was like the best place for a young artist to get an education. So by the time he's a little bit older as a teen, he's helping Verrocchio out with major projects, including this project to put this giant sphere on top of the dome of the Florence Cathedral. Now, just engineering the dome took decades to do. And when it was eventually completed, they realized that they wanted sort of like a lightning rod on top of it. And Verrocchio was hired to create this sphere here. I've read that it's both gold and copper. It looks gold to me, but this is a replica. We can see that it is roughly the size of a human. It's about 6.5 feet across. And his studio not only had to produce it, but then figure out a way to get it on top of the Duomo. And that's exactly what Leonardo was kind of born to do, make something and then find the solutions. So that's just what they did. And I've read that this sphere weighed anywhere from like 1 ton to 18 tons. In any event, it was heavy. All right, so he's getting all sorts of good experience. And eventually he does start helping out with the painting at this painter's studio. And we know that he contributed to this work by Verrocchio. This is called the Baptism of Christ. It's from 1475. And so young Leonardo would have still been, well, about 20 years old at this point, in his early 20s. So we can see here John the Baptist, who's usually depicted as like this very gaunt and kind of sinewy figure, is baptizing Jesus at the center. And this pyramidal composition is completed by these 2 kneeling angels on the side of Jesus. And we know from at the very least the brushwork that Leonardo contributed to this painting, probably the background, almost certainly to some of the muscles on Jesus's torso. And then we know for certain that Leonardo painted this one angel. And if we zoom in on the angels for just a second, you can see a real distinction in terms of the way that they were painted. Leonardo's angel is just markedly more beautiful than Verrocchio's. Notice the complexity of the pose, kind of looking over the shoulder. Notice like the softness of that skin and how he suggests the 3-dimensionality of that face with so much subtlety. And then we've got these cascading golden curls there as well. Apparently, Verrocchio saw what Leonardo could do at this young age and supposedly laid down his brush and never painted again. You just got to love a story like that, right? So, when it comes to Leonardo himself, we don't have a lot of evidence in terms of what he looked like. These are basically like two confirmed portraits that were done of him during his lifetime. This one on the left was just confirmed within like the past 5 years. Um, he was known to be a rather handsome man, and he definitely had charisma. He could kind of own any room that he went into. So he was popular, people gravitated towards him, and he had talents. Like he could pick up an instrument and play it really, really well. Now, beyond this, we don't really know much about him. He never married, he didn't have any children, he was almost certainly gay. But like I said, his personal life really remains kind of a mystery. You can almost get a sense of what he might have looked like, lost in thought, or trying to get a thought out in this moment as part of a conversation. But this is really our best insight into the artist. A lot of other depictions of Leonardo are done posthumously. This is a sculpture of the artist outside the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, done years after his death. Now, the first biography that was written of Leonardo was published about 30 years after his death as well. And it was written by an artist, a fellow artist named Giorgio Vasari. And he said Leonardo had such a power of intellect that whatever he turned his mind to, he made himself a master with ease. So beyond being handsome and well-dressed, Leonardo was brilliant. He was a polymath. He was a genius. In addition to traditional art forms like painting, sculpture, architecture, Leonardo was an astronomer, a botanist, a geologist, a mathematician, and an engineer. He also loved wordplay, puzzles, riddles, poems, that sort of thing. And like I said, he was a musician. Not only could he play, but he actually composed music as well. And you might be thinking, wow, I've never heard a Leonardo da Vinci original. That's because nobody knows where they are. But how exciting would it be if someday somebody unearths some document, some composition that Leonardo da Vinci wrote 500 years ago, and we could listen to it with our own ears? Now, he was practically universally respected during his lifetime. And I'm sure most of you have seen this image before. This is a famous painting by the Renaissance artist Raphael. He's about a generation younger than Leonardo da Vinci, and he painted this picture called the School of Athens about 1511 inside the Pope's apartment in the Vatican. And in this painting, he assembles all of the greatest thinkers through history in this kind of impossible gathering where they're all exchanging their ideas and their wisdom in this imagined classical space here. And right at the center, he portrays Plato and Aristotle. And in this picture, he models his Plato after none other than Leonardo da Vinci. So to put him right at the center of all of these great thinkers really shows how highly Raphael esteemed this figure. So we'll wrap up this section here by looking at what is purported to be the only self-portrait by Leonardo da Vinci. It's widely accepted, not universally accepted. Supposedly, if he had drawn this of himself, he would have been about 60 years old at the time. And to me, that this just looks like he's too old to be 60 here. So he does look like this sage-like figure. He's got the bushy eyebrows, the long hair, and the long beard, and this kind of downturned mouth. He seems to be kind of gazing intently here. And if it looks like his eyes are sort of slightly misaligned, that's probably that's probably true for Leonardo. There are some people that know way more about eyesight than I do who actually allege that that was part of his gift when rendering things in 3 dimensions. In any event, whether or not he created this image, we have this notion that this figure here looks like a philosopher, a prophet, almost like a god-like figure, whether we're talking about a Christian god or a pagan god. And in the end, that's exactly what Leonardo turned out to be in the history of art. He is considered really, truly one of the best of the best. So we're going to turn our attention now to his drawings and hopefully develop a better understanding of all the things that he was looking at and exploring and rendering in his notebooks. So I want to just start off with these two images just to get us oriented. Now, experts agree that Leonardo da Vinci probably produced somewhere between 13 and 15,000 notebook pages during his lifetime. That might sound like a lot, but I'm sure teenagers are probably texting about the same number of words every month on their phones. Nowhere near as brilliant, though, right? It's kind of impossible to know how many pages Leonardo produced because after his death, his notebooks were kind of disassembled and scattered to different collectors and buyers. Now, some of his notebooks were arranged in specific order that he was very thoughtful and mindful of that, which makes us think that he intended to publish them. Some of his other notebooks were just random collections of stuff, really. So it's good to know too, as we're looking at these images, that Leonardo da Vinci did write backwards. We don't really know why. We do know that he was a lefty. He was also ambidextrous, but he was dominant left-handed. So that might have been simply because he didn't want to get his hand dirty while he was writing. Got a little 5-year-old who's just really starting to write now, and he's a lefty, and his impulse is to go that way as well. But it also could have been that he intended to have his notebooks published. And before the printing press, you had to engrave all of this text, and you would have had to do it backwards in order to get a printed image that was legible. So that could be another reason. The final thought around this backwards handwriting is that it was a way to make his writing just a little bit more private, a little bit more difficult for the average person to read. It's kind of like having a diary with a little lock on it that you could easily pick, right? But it makes it makes his writing harder to discern for the average person. Now, the other thing, as we're looking at this engineering image over here on the right, what's important for us to know is that he was making sketches, scientific drawings, he was plotting experiments, and he was conceptualizing inventions throughout his lifetime. Many of these were way ahead of his time, including flying machines that we'll see, armored vehicles, and even an early form of a robot. In these drawings, he is conceptualizing how to lift water. And prior to this moment, really people were just like lifting up pails of water. And he is sort of reviving an ancient idea here called an Archimedean screw. And this is something that does work, actually. But these are the kinds of problems that he would trouble himself with. Now, Leonardo's notebooks are arranged into codexes, and some of them are really big. The biggest one, I believe, is called the Codex Atlanticus. It's over 1,100 pages, and it's all been digitized. So you can go online and go through his notebooks. Some of it is hard to understand. Some of it is very clear to understand. But one codex of just 72 pages, called the Codex Leicester, was purchased by none other than Bill Gates. That's him in the picture, with the codex in front of him. And he bought it for $60 million when adjusted for inflation. He purchased it back in 1994 for about $30 million. And it remains to this day the highest amount of money that's ever been paid for a manuscript, including the first printing of the US Constitution. So not only does it mark, again, the value of Leonardo's thoughts, but it also shows that Bill Gates, who was at the time like this emerging figure in the world of electronics and home computing, it showed him aligning himself with a genius, with that kind of creative and inventive thinking. So let's turn our attention to probably the most famous drawing from Leonardo da Vinci, and that is, of course, the Vitruvian Man. That dates to about 1490. And so there's a lot going on in this picture for us to unpack. Of course, simply put, Leonardo da Vinci has drawn a male figure who is inscribed in both a circle and a square. And by aligning the human body with those geometric forms, The forms themselves kind of function as being perfect forms, and it's a way to suggest the perfection, maybe even the divinity of the human form as well. Notice that he is showing the body in two different positions simultaneously. I think that's just really interesting. We don't really see anything like that again until like the 20th century with like Duchamp's nude descending the staircase. So what the reason why this is called the Vitruvian Man is that Leonardo was exploring ideas from an ancient architect and an ancient philosopher named Vitruvius, who was very interested in aligning human proportions with the proportions of sacred spaces, of temples. And so we of course know that the Renaissance was a time of rebirth. It was the rebirth of classical thinking. And so Leonardo is reviving this interest in the perfection of the human form and its alignment with these perfect geometries. So there's a lot more to say about this, but in the interest of time, I will just say, of course, that this is a work that's been parodied so many times. I remember when I was a kid, there was a Bowflex commercial that featured the Vitruvian Man. I think that was my first introduction to it. And if you go to Vinci, Italy, you can see the Vitruvian Man in 3D here in this sculpture. Now, this is not where Da Vinci's exploration of the human body ends, not by any stretch of the imagination. He continued to explore the human body for years. Leonardo da Vinci famously dissected somewhere between 30 to 50 cadavers during his lifetime without the aid of refrigeration. So this was something that he was very determined to do. And his drawings that he produced as a result of those careful scientific studies that he was doing are still relevant today. They're incredible anatomy drawings. And I should mention, nothing like this existed before Da Vinci. There were anatomy drawings out there, but they were not even close to being this detailed. So you can see that in addition to doing very careful renderings of what like muscles and bones and sinews all look like, he was also rotating the body so that you could see it from different angles to fully understand it. This is like the very foundation of scientific drawing. This is still the way people who specialize in anatomical drawings still do it. Sometimes he would even do like a cross section or an exploded view. He kind of invented it all. But we can see here from his study of a shoulder, it seems to have this kind of cross-pollination with his paintings sometimes. In this case, I think the painting came before the drawing. But what we're looking at is an unfinished painting of Saint Jerome in the desert. And if you're anything like me, this unfinished painting, my eye just goes right to that big shoulder and that sort of, I don't know if this is like a sinew or a muscle right there. It looks sort of unusual. It almost seems as though Da Vinci himself is like fascinated or obsessed with the skeletal structure and the muscles of this figure. And notice how he stretched his neck to one side and then extended his arm out in the other direction to get this exact pose to allow for him to explore that shoulder in depth, right? It's you can see that he was almost distracted by it. That becomes the focus. So he doesn't just stop at the shoulder, of course. What we're looking at on the right is detailed anatomical studies of the human hand, and on the left is a page of human hands in different poses and gestures. And this would be the kind of thing that a Renaissance artist would have in their portfolio. And believe it or not, when clients would come to them with commissions, they could sort of leaf through the portfolio and say, oh, I'd like a saint with their hand in this position or another one with their hand like this. And for Da Vinci, not only could he produce the hands, but he wanted to understand the mechanism of the hand. You can almost imagine him thinking of the human body as like a machine. And so he would carefully dissect these parts of the body. And then his notes almost like start with the bare bones and then build it up so we can see exactly how it works. I particularly love this, this rendering of the skeleton, the finger from a side view and how that works and contracts there. And then I think it's fascinating that modeling today looks so similar to the way that he exposed the human hand so that you could see how all of those muscles and tendons and sinews work together. So again, a man that was way ahead of his time. He also dissected human embryos, human fetuses. I'm not quite sure about the distinction there, but what we can see here is that he's basically cracked open a uterus as though it was like a nutshell and shown us a baby in utero, again, from different perspectives so that we could understand it completely. He's showing us the vascular system that's involved. He's interested in the umbilical cord, and he gets almost all of it right. It's pretty astonishing. And again, nobody was really doing this prior to Da Vinci. Here we have his very careful study of a human skull. We can see it's cut down the center, and on the right side, it's complete. And on the left side, we can see these cavities. It's been kind of opened up and exposed. We can also see his fascination with the teeth. He took each one out. He knew the shape. He numbered them. So I think with the exposure of the interior of the skull here too, it's kind of suggesting his fascination with the brain. He's kind of getting towards it. But with the drawing on the right, this beautiful drawing of a woman's face, you can also see that his understanding of skulls and skeletons and anatomy, it's all at play here. He knew the muscles, he knew the skeletal structure, and so he could perfectly shade these faces to suggest everything that lay underneath that skin. And he does it so well. But he wasn't just fascinated with beauty. There's always like one step further, right? He was also fascinated with grotesques. It's sort of like Leonardo imagining what happens if the skull continued to grow, or the nose, or a chin, or the back of the head. We don't quite know his purpose for creating his grotesques. I think he intended for them to be funny, but I think most art historians don't want to admit that. Leonardo called them his fantastical faces. And oftentimes they sort of seem like mockeries to me, especially this woman over here with the really sort of like elongated skull, but also like the flower in her bosom here as though she's courting someone. So there's a silliness to it. Now, here he is kind of stretching out proportions, and we can see the same idea at play with this page from his notebooks on the left. You can sort of see a human face that's been stretched out and an eyeball that has been stretched out. And of course, those distortions resolve themselves if you are to tip the page upward and sort of look down at it from an oblique angle. So what we're looking at here is the very first known depiction of an anamorphism. And so he is really interested in perspective. He's really interested in the way our eyes perceive the world, these kind of distortions. In centuries following this invention here, anamorphisms are used for all different reasons. Sometimes they're used to mask a caricature or an erotic image or something like that, but it's a way to make something not easily discernible, sort of like the way he was writing backwards. So I sort of see a connection between those things. So looking at an eye, I'm going to segue into his careful observations of the natural world. He wasn't just studying human beings and their anatomy. He liked animals as well. In fact, he almost certainly was a vegetarian, and for reasons of loving all living things. There's a famous story of him buying these caged doves and immediately setting them free. He seemed to have a true regard for all living creatures. And I think with these studies of cats and a dragon, I don't know if you noticed the dragon in here too, he gives us such a good sense in terms of the movement, the habits, the mannerisms of this animal. And it brings us back to that image that we started with tonight, which is his portrait of a lady with an ermine from about 1490. And we're not going to go too deep into her tonight, but this ermine, this sort of strange creature in her arms, it is, I think it's sort of a result of these kinds of careful observations, particularly of cats, But notice how he's positioned his lovely lady here in a sort of unusual pose. She's turned in a three-quarter profile view, but she's looking over her shoulder, kind of stretching her neck this way. And you can see the animal kind of reflecting that twisting pose. She's raised one hand to stroke the ermine on the back, and the ermine itself has also raised one hand too. So there's this nice little physical relationship between the woman and the ermine in this particular picture. So he's studying anatomy, he's studying animals. Of course, that extends to the natural world too. Here we're looking at a landscape that he drew when he was just 21 years old. This is of the Arno River Valley. And believe it or not, this is one of the first documented pure landscape pictures in the history of Western art. He didn't invent it, but he was one of the only people that ever did it for reasons that were just for pure interest in the landscape. It's pretty unbelievable. So we've got these great mountains and cliffs and the valley itself extending off into the distance. So he could kind of do the macro and the micro. Here we have his careful study of oak leaves and the acorns. I think most of us, if we're thinking about drawing a tree, we'd probably draw the whole thing, but this is him kind of zooming in almost in the same way he needs to know how the hand works. He gives us this lovely drawing of the details of this stem with the spray of acorns here. So Leonardo da Vinci is carefully observing the world around him. Believe it or not, this notebook page that we're looking at here, these little doodles in the margin, are apparently Leonardo da Vinci working out gravity. 100 years before others, Galileo, Sir Isaac Newton, he's thinking about gravity and how it works and sort of plotting it out scientifically here. And it makes sense for him to do this because Leonardo da Vinci was obsessed with flight his entire life. So he had a whole codex on the flight of birds. This was a topic that he was just, it fascinated him. He produced more than 35,000 words about flight in his notebooks with 500 sketches dealing with flight. So these are just the observations of birds, but he wanted to know how could human beings fly? Interestingly, a researcher recently was able to isolate the background of one of the pages in the Codex of the Flight of Birds, isolate the background from the text above it, and we see this what looks like a human face. And most researchers agree that this is probably a self-portrait of Leonardo da Vinci right there in his notebooks about flight. Now, Leonardo said that when he was a baby, he had this memory of being in a cradle and this kite, this bird of prey, coming down and landing on his chest and opening his mouth with its tail. So this experience apparently galvanized him because he went on to create all of these fascinating contraptions to try and aid human beings in flight. And these are really different approaches to flying as well. Sometimes he would try to replicate bird wings or bat wings. Sometimes it's human movement that would generate the movement of these wings. Sometimes he was producing gliders or parachutes. But like I said, he was coming up with all these different ideas for humans to fly. Obviously, humans didn't fly until the 20th century. So keeping our eyes up in the skies, Leonardo da Vinci was also thinking about aerial views of cities. And here we are looking at his view of a town in Italy called Imola. He produced this for this kind of mercenary figure. It would be very helpful in wartime to be able to have an exact map of a city, to know how to be able to get around. You can see his drawing in comparison to a Google Earth satellite view, and you can see how the walls of that city, the main thoroughfares, he mapped them out nearly perfectly. We believe he was moving through the city and actually calculating the angles of the buildings in order to produce a map this accurate, but he's letting us see the world too from the point of view of a bird. So we wrap up this section by looking at two notebook pages here where we can see some of his inventions for weapons of war. And this would have been a big facet in terms of what he produced, not because this philosopher, animal loving person was so interested in fighting, but that was a way to make him very valuable to potential patrons. So we're looking over here on the left at something that almost looks like a figure who has like a chariot with spinning sides on it. Down here, this is what art historians agree is sort of like an early version of an armored tank. And then over on the right, this is an enormous crossbow. So there's a famous letter of introduction that Leonardo wrote when he was about 30 years old. He was introducing himself to the Duke of Milan, whose patronage he was seeking. And he wrote 11 bullet points of things that he could do for the Duke. And almost all of them involved creating these kinds of weapons of war. The very last thing he mentioned was, oh, and I can paint. So let's use that as our moment to segue over to Leonardo's paintings. Okay, so like I said, there aren't a lot of them, and those that do exist, a lot of them are unfinished. He was a famous unfinisher. So the first image that we're going to take a look at is Leonardo's earliest major work called the Annunciation. This is from 1472 to 76. It's at the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. It is over 7 feet long, and it's an oil on panel. So he was still a very young man when he produced this. He was still working in the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio. And I should mention that the Annunciation scene was a very popular subject in Florence at the time. There were many other artists that depicted it. So there's kind of a familiar layout to this. You get the angel Gabriel, who is coming with this divine message from God himself to tell the Virgin Mary that she is divinely pregnant with the Son of God. So it is this moment, it's a painting that's all about communication when it comes down to it, right? So there's some almost formulaic ways that this painting has been produced in the past. I'd like to show you a prominent example of an Annunciation scene from Italy in the 1400s, so just prior to Da Vinci. This is Fra Angelico's Annunciation scene. And there are some constants here, right? There's the angel and Mary dynamic. The other important element is that Mary is oftentimes depicted as being in an enclosed garden. That would be a symbol of her purity, the idea that her body has been closed off as well. We'll get into how Da Vinci sort of alters this sense of compression that you might feel as you look at Fra Angelico's painting. But notice the communication in Fra Angelico's painting is done solely through eye contact, really, and these mirrored poses, both of these figures seemingly hugging themselves in this moment. But for Leonardo, he believes so strongly in the power of the gesture. It goes back to all of those studies of human hands. And so the communication of this very important message comes to us by way of this hand, and it is received over here by Mary. Notice that Leonardo breaks that private garden wall that is supposed to, symbolically represent Mary here in order to spotlight that gesture from the angel. It also takes our eye back to this, this vast expanse of a background. I'm going to sort of zoom in on this for you so that you can see just how much detail is beyond these figures here. It's really quite stunning. So, here we go. So we can see that a lot is being portrayed here. We're not even getting into like all of the botany here, but I will just say that with this picture, Leonardo is sort of showing that he has learned the rules of art. He has nearly perfect perspective in this picture. If you were to extend all of these architectural lines infinitely, they look like they would all converge at this one point near the center of the picture called the vanishing point. You can see that some of those lines are just slightly off. It's nothing I would ever fuss about, right? Another rule that he has learned and employs so well is what's called, or what's known as, the golden ratio, or even the divine ratio. This is the Fibonacci sequence of numbers where we have this regular space that routinely adds on to itself and grows at this predictable pattern that creates this wonderful spiral. And the spiral becomes a great way to organize a painting, a divine way to organize a painting. So in this case, it's that message kind of swooping around and then drawing our eye into Mary, sort of the most important part of the picture. Now, he knows all of these rules, and then he sort of abandons them with this next painting I want to show you. This is his Virgin of the Rocks. There are two versions, and this is the first one. This is the one that's at the Louvre Museum. He was commissioned to create this work around 1483. So this is like way before the Mona Lisa or the Last Supper. This was supposed to be an altarpiece, and we have the contract. We know exactly what he signed up to do. The monks of this monastery wanted a virgin and child, essentially, and talked about, what they would be doing. And Leonardo produced this very strange painting as a result. So we have four figures here. We have the Virgin, we have John the Baptist over here, and that's the baby that Mary is actually holding with her hand in this kind of unusual position. Notice that the thumb is kind of coming over the baby's shoulder, and then the infant Jesus, is sitting down below, kind of cradled by an angel over here. And curiously, the angel's pointing to John the Baptist, but looking out at us. Mary's hand is coming down. So we have this beautiful kind of trifecta of these gestures, these poses, that reminds us how important these hands are to communication. For Leonardo da Vinci, there's sort of like a stereotype of Italians really talking with their hands. Leonardo plays into that. He thinks that hands are as important as faces in terms of expression. So in addition to that, we have this strange space that they occupy, this kind of gravity-defying grotto where all of these boulders seem to be hovering in midair. This could have been inspired by the fact that sometimes nativity scenes were done in caves rather than in barns, but we don't really know why Leonardo made some of these choices. What we do know is that the people that commissioned the work were not satisfied with it. And ultimately, like 25 years later, Leonardo da Vinci had to produce another version of the Virgin of the Rocks. And we can see that a couple of things are, well, one important thing is resolved here. The fact that the angel is now no longer pointing at John the Baptist. So we don't have that confusion. And you'll notice too, in the second version, which is at the National Gallery in London, now all of these divine figures have halos. Curiously, Leonardo da Vinci didn't include that in the first version. I think he was trying to express the fact that he could make figures so beautiful, divinely perfect, that they wouldn't need these halos. Turned out to be a point of contention. So we have, in the end, these kind of fascinating gestures, a mysterious biblical scene here. It leads us all into the most epic dinner party of all time. Hold on to your hats, right? We are looking at the Last Supper, painted between 1495 and 1498. This is the only fresco we're going to see tonight. So that is a painting that's done directly in wet plaster so that when it dries, it becomes a permanent part of the wall. This is a very labor-intensive kind of painting, and it's purely driven by the speed at which the plaster is drying. So you can only get so much done a day. So Leonardo, maybe I should start off by saying, he was not the first person to paint this scene. He's probably just most famous for it. And I want to quickly share with you two other versions of the Last Supper that were painted just decades before his. And these are examples that he was no doubt familiar with. So we can see in both of these examples one obvious thing, and that is that these artists have both put the figure of Judas on the other side of the table. Now, none of us have ever gone out to eat with our 12 best friends and all sat at a table like this. So there's something almost theatrical about the setup to begin with, but there's something also that's, I don't know, that's unsatisfying with the solution of putting Judas on the other side of the table. So we'll see how Leonardo resolves that. We can also see that these are fairly quiet meals here. And what Leonardo decided to paint was the very moment when Christ says to his disciples, "One of you will betray me." So what we see here is this ripple of emotion going through this crowd. Again, it feels like theater, right? They're on a stage, and all of these emotions are so legible to us because not only is it the faces and the poses, but it's those gestures, it's those hands. They spell out so much here. And Leonardo does some really smart things here. He makes it easy for us to understand because he groups the disciples in small groups of three. So our eye can move across the picture and sort of digest each small group at a time. And he anchors all of this emotion with this very rational space. We'll talk a little bit more about the linear perspective that he's using here, but I do want to just highlight for a moment how different the emotion is in this scene from previous versions of The Last Supper by other artists. I mean, look at how kind of blasé these disciples are over here on the left. It's sort of like, no way, wasn't me. It's the most half-hearted denial ever, right? But here you can feel what these disciples are feeling as they're denying and maybe even accusing each other. And then here we can just quickly see the perspectival lines that helped Leonardo da Vinci make this such a rational space and also underscore the importance of Jesus in this composition too. Now, none of these figures have halos again, but you could sort of make the case that this kind of half moon shape, this rounded pediment at the top of the door here can kind of function as like an architectural halo there. So it, again, provides this great sense of order. And if you're in the room where this was painted, if you're in this dining hall in a monastery, standing sort of further back, it almost looks as though Leonardo da Vinci's painting is an extension of the room itself. The perspective works so well. You can also kind of get a sense of just the scale of this painting here too. Believe it's something like 25 feet across, maybe about 15 feet tall, if I'm remembering correctly. So it's, roughly the size of a studio apartment, maybe. So it's a really large painting. And what's sort of fascinating to me is that in his sketches, Da Vinci was sort of playing with the idea of having Judas sit on the other side of the table. That was what he knew. And then he innovated something else. And it's the solution that we've all come to know and love so well. Now, there's one last story that goes along with his Judas, who's sitting over here with his elbow on the table. Supposedly, the man who was in charge of overseeing him painting at this monastery was really giving him a hard time over how much time it was taking to finish the picture. Leonardo had spent some time sort of wandering the streets looking for someone who looked like a criminal that he could model his Judas after. And supposedly, after this manager type was bothering him, he decided to model his Judas after him. So once again, just important to note that none of these figures have halos. This was such a deviation from the norm at the time. Now, we won't spend too much time going into it, but Leonardo da Vinci really experimented with his materials, and the painting began to almost immediately degrade. By 100 years after the fact that it was painted, people were calling it the Lost Supper. And over the years, it's been sort of used and abused. Here we're looking at a photograph on the left of that same building where the ceiling had caved in because the building was bombed during World War II. Over on the right is a photograph of Leonardo's Last Supper in the 1970s. That's the kind of rough shape that it was in. There was a lot of moisture in the building too. Looks like there's green mold growing on it. So today, what is left of Leonardo's work is very carefully preserved, and we're so lucky because there is some of the greatest storytelling, and such an incredible composition, really second to none. So we're going to wrap up tonight with portraiture, and we will touch on the Mona Lisa too, but we have two finished portraits. He painted 4 finished portraits of women. We only have time to look at 2. So his first and his last, we are looking at the 16-year-old Ginevra da Vinci that Leonardo painted when he was just 22 years old. This is in the collection of the National Gallery of Art, DC, so you don't have to renew your passport if you wanted to see Da Vinci up close and personal. So with this work, he was using oil paint, which was still a fairly new medium at the time. And we see that he uses it to great effect to try and suggest the contours, try and model her face here. And she kind of looks like a marble sculpture in some ways, doesn't she? It's this pale skin, and he contrasts that with like the beautiful ringlets of her hair. The end result, though, is this kind of calm, almost sullen-eyed or haughty expression that she has here, very heavy-lidded eyes, no hint of a smile, right? We've got the suggestion of this vast expanse in the background. Now, I want to share with you some of the ways that this was a really innovative painting for this young 22-year-old artist. At the time, formal portraits in Italy oftentimes were portrayed figures in profile. And this is a tradition that goes back to like ancient Roman coins. But this was the way formal portraits were done. His innovation here and he wasn't the first one to do it, but he was one of the first to portray his subject in 3/4 profile is revolutionary. And of course, we all do this today. Now, if we go to get our portraits done with a photographer, we all want to sort of do what Ginevra da Vinci here is doing. Now, Leonardo is someone who really believed in the power of the expressive power of human hands. And what's fascinating to me is that Ginevra da Vinci here was actually cut down at one point in time. And we believe that the rest of the picture included her hands here. She would have been holding a flower that would have had some symbolic significance at the time. But the complete work was actually a half-length portrait, not a bust-length portrait, which again would have been a deviation from the norm. It's the same setup as this most famous painting on the planet, the Mona Lisa. So we've got the half-length portrait, the 3/4 profile, and so much is similar, but in 30 years since he painted the first, so much has changed, right? So we can just first acknowledge how important the Mona Lisa is to us even today. About 10 million people visit the Louvre Museum every year. 80% of them admit that they're just there to see the Mona Lisa, which is, as a result, sort of a letdown for a lot of people. It's just this small painting. It's only about 30 by 21 inches. So it tends to be a letdown. But let's talk about what makes it extraordinary. This was painted around 1503. And actually, let's go back to this side-by-side comparison here. We can see that what has sort of stayed true here. We have the inclusion of the hands here in these kind of delicate poses that kind of speak to the character of the individuals that he was painting. But we also have major differences. Notice now this kind of fantastical expanse of landscape behind the Mona Lisa. We've got a bridge, we've got these winding trails, we've got a body of water, and maybe even like a standing lake up here. It's a little bit difficult to discern, but we also have what looks like an inconsistent horizon line here. That has fascinated scholars for years because, quite simply, Leonardo wouldn't make a mistake there. Some people think that he was trying to sort of emphasize one half of the picture for symbolic purposes. But we should notice too that the Mona Lisa is sitting in a chair. Her arm is resting on the arm of a chair here. She's also sitting in front of this balustrade and framed by the base of these columns over here. Now, we can also see that he painted her irises kind of in the corner of her eye sockets here, her pupils and her irises, I should say. And so there is this wonderful sense of connection. It sort of feels like she's looking at us. I think the myth that her eyes follow you has sort of been debunked, but there is a more powerful connection at play. But the biggest difference, I would say, is the way he has rendered the skin, the flesh of these figures, which involves the shadows. So Ginevra da Vinci, she looks like a marble sculpture. And the Mona Lisa, her flesh, particularly her hands, the skin around her eyes and her cheeks here, it looks absolutely lifelike. He's using a technique here that he essentially invented. It, the Italians call it sfumato. It's this hazy, smudgy shading here. Sfumato roughly translates to like up in smoke. So that's where we get this kind of smoky, sooty, ashy feeling to it, but there's no hard lines here. All of the suggestion of anatomy, the skeleton, the muscles, the tendons, the sinews, it's all understood to be under this very soft flesh. Now we know Leonardo studied the human mouth. This is like one of his studies here. He knew exactly how a smile would work. In fact, you might even say that this smile here is a study or a reference to this very famous smile over here. But what we do know is that he ultimately enlivened the face of the Mona Lisa by using that smudgy shading technique. Oh, I'm sort of jumping ahead of myself here. But we can see that he sort of breathes life into this figure by just adding this suggestion of a smile with that haziness around the corners of her mouth. And I go back to the divine proportions here just for a moment, because using those rules that Renaissance artists would have known, that Fibonacci sequence of numbers, it's a great way to take our eyes from her hands right to that point in her face that seems most important. His biographer wrote at 30-something years after his death that in this work of Leonardo, there is a smile so pleasing that it is a thing more divine than human to behold, and that essentially he goes on to say that he could see her beating heart in her chest. So he was really kind of latching on to an innovative way to make a painting and to make a picture of a real person. So she has been dazzling us ever since, of course. So we will quickly conclude now in the interest of time. Well, Leonardo da Vinci spent the last few years of his life living in France. He crossed the Alps carrying the Mona Lisa and had the patronage of none other than the King of France. And this is a painting that was done about 300 years after Leonardo's death, where he's on his deathbed in the arms of the king. This was painted by the artist Ang, but it was sort of a great way for him to end his rather short life. He died at the age of 67, but he had this kind of freedom to explore and to think and to run experiments in his old age. If you're dying to see his final resting place, well, it's actually in France with the Mona Lisa, along with the Mona Lisa. This is the small church where supposedly his remains are. We don't quite know for sure because I guess the graveyard where he was buried was disturbed during the French Revolution. So this is in Amboise, France. Now, we'll wrap up tonight just by briefly acknowledging the impact that Leonardo's work has had just on the art world, let alone everything else, right? But we've got none other than Norman Rockwell. You know, I love him. This is one of his April Fool's Day covers. And tucked over here in the corner, Norman Rockwell's done his own version of the Mona Lisa backwards with a halo, sort of winking at us. And then we've got Andy Warhol over here on the right, playing with that shadow at the corner of the Mona Lisa's mouth. So when we think about Leonardo da Vinci, he is a figure that has forever changed our culture. He reminds us that the boundaries between art and science are meant to be blurred, that curiosity is the engine of innovation. He once wrote, "Beauty perishes in life, but is immortal in art." And it seems his beautiful mind has made him immortal to all of us. So I will end there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments you have about Leonardo da Vinci. Thank you so much, everyone, for spending your evening with me. I'm going to start with the Q&A because we only have 3 questions there. It seems like this could go easily. Karen asks, in the anatomical drawings, is the text written backwards too? Karen, as far as I understand, yes, it is. If anybody reads Italian, reads it backwards and knows better, please feel free to correct me on that one. John asks, did he write in his notes that he was interested in the way hands worked? It's a good question. I guess I just surmised that from those very detailed drawings, and with, you know, especially how he's showing like the way the finger worked, and he's giving us this kind of peekaboo look at the hands that way. So I think he thought of the human body as like a machine, and he really kind of wanted to understand exactly how it worked, not just hands, but everything. Great question, John. Muriel asks, could you spell out the curly Q artistic form so I can look it up? Oh, that is the Fibonacci sequence. Let's see if I can type that out in the chat for you. Let me just make sure everybody can see this. Fibonacci. I think I spelled that right. If you're interested in it, it's touched upon in the Da Vinci Code. My 9-year-old's getting really into the Fibonacci sequence right now. Thank you, everybody, for your very kind words as I'm going through some of these comments here. I love and appreciate everything that everybody's written. I just want to make sure I can get to any questions that anybody might have asked. Let's see. Oh, somebody, Tish noted that even the canvas had age spots. That's interesting that you noticed that. That would have been in his self-portrait. And there's even some writing about that particular issue too. There's another question here. What are the seals on the bottom right of his sketches? I would imagine that is part of the way of organizing them and showing ownership of them. But I'm not totally sure, Diana. That's a good question as well. Do we know his IQ? Linda, we might have to Google that one. So Tish says it was invented in 1904. So maybe it's unknowable, but off the charts, certainly. Judy asks, I'm wondering if we could hold questions and discussion till the end of the program. Okay, let's see. Did he do any astrological drawings? I believe he did. In most summaries in terms of his interests, people refer to him as being an astronomer. I didn't come across those in my research, and I took out every Leonardo da Vinci book from the library. I didn't come across any of those drawings, but that's not to say they don't exist, because I'm sure I have not seen all 13,000 of them. Thank you, everybody, for the very kind words. Ellen says, what is in the middle of the bottom of the Last Supper? Oh, great question, Ellen. I'm sorry I didn't note that. That's actually a doorway that was cut into the painting. Can you imagine? There are copies. This is a giant door right there. They actually cut off Jesus's feet. But we do have contemporary copies of the painting, so we know what his feet actually look like. They're sort of like this. They almost look like his feet were already crucified, believe it or not. Let's see here. Oh, and Bet got to see it. That's on my bucket list, Bet. Let's see. Do all three Last Suppers have the disciples in the same order around the table? Diana, great question. I am not sure about that. I know that the order is noted. Well, we certainly know who is who in Da Vinci's, and I know that he was interested in placing at least St. John in a particular spot. So I'm not sure if the Gospels prescribe where everybody was sitting, but some of those figures they do, if that answers your question at all. I'm not sure if it was consistent from one painter to another, but I will say, if we go back here, I believe it's St. John who's described as kind of like resting on Jesus's bosom in, I think it's the Gospel of St. Luke. So you can see it sort of looks like a sleeping figure in both of these. And in Da Vinci's sketch, he was kind of thinking about doing the same thing. So we don't know how much of, I don't know personally how much of that was just based on his observation of other paintings or how much of it that is based in the Gospels. I'm just not that familiar with it. Let's see here. Oh, yes, Tish, thanks for mentioning that. I was reading about this the other day. Well, there was like a recent op-ed in the New York Times where they said you should just put the Mona Lisa in a different building and just let it be that and let it be not just a tourist trap, but a place where people can go and just have their Mona Lisa experience so that it doesn't disrupt the rest of the Louvre Museum. Oh, thank you, Carol, for your very kind words. Everybody, Patty, Carol, Patricia, thank you so much. Ralph says 67 was quite old for the time, wasn't it? It probably was. I said relatively young to us, I guess, Ralph. That's a good thing to note. I'm so glad people felt like they learned a lot about Leonardo da Vinci. Oh, thank you so much. Very, very kind words. The caption's called the Uffizi Gallery, the Pizza Gallery. Apparently, you have to get a pizza when you go. And Teresa says, I'm a native of Stockbridge. Norman Rockwell was a very pleasant man who scooped up children from the street and brought them to his studio to paint them. Oh, too bad. If only you had red hair, right? All right. Thank you, everybody. Oh, Sally's here too. Thanks for joining us, Sally Chandler. Um, I really appreciate it, everybody. I'm just going to copy and paste all these very kind messages and enjoy them a little bit later. Next month, we're going to have a little bit of a lighter topic. It's actually going to be art history's best dressed. So if you have a favorite article of clothing from a painting, please feel free to share it with me. I love to hear from people. You can always reach me at my website, which is iamculturallycurious.com. And of course, you can sign up for other Zoom presentations along the way if you're interested. A few other questions came in the Q&A. Oh, somebody asked, was Leonardo religious? Well, this is a little bit difficult to discern. His first biography, the first version, said no. He was more of like a philosopher, lover of nature, basically. And then there was a second version of the biography came out that said he was a very pious man. So I think most Da Vinci scholars would agree that the first version seems a little bit more accurate, especially since he's willing to push the boundaries in terms of what his religious commissions were all about. Diane asked, do all three Last Suppers have the disciples? Oh, yeah, I think we got to that. And is the Norman Rockwell picture backwards? Yes, it is. And he even signed his name backwards. Oh, Rockwell signed his name backwards. The image as I showed it to you is the way it was printed on the cover. The Leonardo is backwards and Rockwell's signature is backwards, but there's like hundreds of April Fool's Day jokes in there for you to discern. And let's see. Have any of his designs creations been reproduced and have worked? That is the million-dollar question, Edward. They probably informed inventions that have worked. I know the flying machines have not. That's the million-dollar question. I think for the most part, he was just thinking about things that were way ahead of his time and involved like machinery that that didn't quite work in the day where he was designing it or dreaming of it. So I think it informed later versions that would work, but I don't think anybody built it as he drew it and it worked, I think. Nancy asked, was the woman depicted as Ginevra da Vinci related to Leonardo? Sorry, Nancy, I wasn't saying her name clearly enough. It's da Vinci, not da Vinci. So there's a B in there, like B as in boy. All right. I think that gets to just about everything. There's really fascinating conversation in the chat here too. Was it illegal or irreligious to dissect corpses in Italy at the time? Great question, Carol. I don't think it was a very popular thing to do, but as I understand it, he was going through kind of the proper channels to do it. He was mostly like working with hospitals. There's stories of him digging up corpses. I don't think he had to do that. It probably wasn't considered the best thing for him to do, but he was also this beloved figure. And I don't think anybody, it doesn't seem like there was like a surge of resentment against him for doing that. But it's a fascinating component to who he is for sure. Other than the Mona Lisa, did he do any paintings in France? How about sculptures? Now, his best known sculpture does not exist anymore. It was a sculpture of a horse. I think it was a figure on a horse. Unfortunately, it was destroyed. And if you want to see the greatest collection of Leonardo da Vinci's work, it is actually at the Louvre Museum. So just a couple of years ago, let's see, he died in 1519 or 1519, I think. And so just a couple of years ago, they did a 500th anniversary exhibition of like they mounted this huge show of his work. So most of it came from the Louvre, and it was, you can imagine nobody wants to loan their Da Vinci's. So I think we got to almost everything. And I'm sure I've worn you out. I'm feeling a little worn out, but I'm honored to have your time and attention. Thank you for making this so joyous and fun. And I look forward to seeing you in a month where we'll be talking about fashion and fur and velvet and satin. It will be fantastic. Have a great night, everybody, and I will see you in the near future. Take care. Bye.